Hello everyone. I'm here to tell you something about PerlIO. Let's start with the history. PerlIO was a new feature in Perl 5.8, which is nowadays 12 years ago. It was quite the essential reason for why it was introduced was Unicode. I'll get back to that in the next slide. PerlIO was designed by Nick Simons. You may have heard of him. He's mainly known for TK. He also was the original author of Encoding. Sadly, he died a couple of years ago, which was really, well, I haven't known him personally, but I'm told he was a really great guy. And the other problem of this was that PerlIO had a bus number of 1. Essentially, after he died, there was no one who maintained it for a couple of years until like 4 or 5 years later I came along and was like, why aren't these bugs getting fixed? I'll fix them myself. Yeah. So Unicode. Perl 5.6 was marketing compatible with Unicode. It has this nice text in it which basically says we need to write PerlIO. It supported Unicode somewhat-ish, but if you actually tried using it, you would write code like this, apparently. Or at least this is the code that I found from those times. Encode.pm didn't exist. This is UTF-8. You don't really want to know what you had to do for other encodings. So instead, we're using PerlIO. It's just this. You basically declare it's this encoding, and then the system will take care of it for you. And this is really great. And to be honest, this is really essential for dealing with Unicode in an end-user-friendly way. I mean, you can use encode explicitly, but how often do people really do that? Most of the time, they do this because the I/O layer is the interface to the outside world. So how does PerlIO work? PerlIO is a stack. You should think of, it's working with a stack of layers. You should think of this as every layer is an object. Every object has a next attribute to the next layer, until you hit the bottom where next is undef. That's essentially the model. And in Perl, you're only interacting with the topmost layer. The rest exists, and there's some ability to introspect it, but unless you're doing that explicitly, you're just looking at the topmost layer. And you can add layers to the top or remove them from the top, and if you do really scary stuff, you can even add them in the middle or remove them, but usually it's really a topmost thing. And the default stack, it's not very, this resolution, it doesn't help with the icon. The default layers are Unix and PerlIO. If you say like use open, not use them, open my foo colon raw, what it does, it adds the raw on top of this. And then the raw does funny things. We'll get back to that later. But this is important to realize. It's really stacking everything on top of each other to get additional behaviors. The base layer almost always is Unix. Unix is really a layer that stays very close to typical Unix I/O semantics. Essentially what sysread and syswrite do, except that it's using a descriptor instead of a file handle. Descriptor is nothing more than a number that the kernel associates with that handle. This is the thing that's doing the actual I/O. Pretty much everything else is just transforming data or buffering data or something else fancy, but not actually doing I/O. There's another base layer called Win32. Unfortunately, it's hopelessly broken. I mean, it works perfectly fine until you start using threads. And since Fork is using threads on Windows, that means that when you build a Perl using this, then the test harness will fail very, very, very early. I'm hoping to get this fixed with some help, because it could be nice to have, but no one's using this. And then we get the buffering. The PerlIO layer is really, really poorly named, because if you see :PerlIO, you would never ever guess what the hell it does, right? Okay. Buffering. Buffering is very, very useful for a lot of things that in Perl you do a lot. In particular, line-based I/O. But also any kind of translation, any kind of encoding, pretty much any kind of post-processing, you want buffering. The only thing you don't want to use it for is binary file slurping, which is why like file slurp is having some crazy hacks on the inside, just basically to avoid the entire buffering layer for a relatively small, well, like 10–20% speed increase. That's worth using like 200 lines of code. So yes, why do we want buffering? Without buffering, this is how you would use readline. Essentially, get one character, see if you now have a string that ends with your chosen new line. If you do, return that string. Otherwise, get another character, get another character, get another character, etc. This is very much correct and very much inefficient. This is a highly simplified and slightly buggy version of how you would do it using buffering. What you do is you peek into the buffer of the I/O layer. You're looking for that new line separator. If you find it, great. Let's return everything up until that point. If you don't, get everything into your collector, refresh the buffer, try again. The actual speed increase by doing this is a factor of a few hundred. This is not a minor optimization. This is very, very important. Unfortunately, this code is uniquely optimized in Perl core. And when I say uniquely optimized, I mean it's about 150 lines. And in 150 lines, it contains 6 go-tos to 4 labels. It is very optimized. And for something I want to do, I kind of need to refactor that. You can guess what I think of this. No, really, it's really that bad. So yes, essentially, :PerlIO is nothing more than boring buffering without any kind of manipulation of the data. This is the default on Unix because Unix is a sane operating system. Then, of course, there's Windows, which does carriage return line feed. Does anyone here know why Windows is using carriage return line feed? Yes, this is for.
It's fail.
Hmm? What? The original reason for Windows for doing this is because like physical printing terminals on CP/M, like an operating system from like 35 years ago, required this. And they never got rid of this, and now all text files and everything terminal related is using carriage return new line. yeah. So we have a CRLF layer that is doing nothing more than just getting rid of all carriage returns before new lines on reading, and vice versa on writing, just adding them back in. Except that this is implemented very confusingly. If you have a handle and you introspect it and you see a CRLF layer, you cannot assume this is happening, because it has a flag. It can be turned on and off. It's functioning as the buffering layer and as a transformation layer, which is extremely confusing when you actually want to know, is this raw or not? You cannot tell from the outside, at least not without a little C programming. Scalar, which is basically the other base layer that people use. This is what when you open, like, you say, open myfoo angle brackets and then slash variable, you open like a fake file handle to a scalar. This is really useful and notoriously buggy, because it's actually peeking and poking into the scalar, and I've seen some very funny bugs here. It usually works, but this is worse. It's very useful. It's one of those Perl 5.8 features that it's really helpful, but I really hate the implementation. That's something I'm saying a lot when it comes to PerlIO. That's not me. And then there's UTF-8 and bytes. Did I mention I hate them? No. UTF-8 and byte. In Perl, as some of you may know, on scalars, there's a flag. Is this string, is it Latin 1 or is it UTF-8? This is generally considered a bad idea. Guess what PerlIO does? It has a flag that says the input from this handle is Latin 1, or the input from this output, or this handle is UTF-8. So when you open a file with :UTF-8, you're saying, I'm promising this is UTF-8. You don't have to check. There actually has been, at some, it might have been DEF CON or one of those big hacker conferences, there has been a concept exploit of getting insecure UTF-8 in and then horribly confusing the regular expression engine, and then it will accept data that it shouldn't accept, and then you can have exploits. So that's one of the more important things to remember in this presentation. Don't use :UTF-8 for input unless you really trust the file.
Tell people what to use instead. Tell people what to use instead.
Yes, I'll get back to that in a moment. The other confusing thing here is that if you use get layers, it will tell you there's a UTF-8 layer, even though there's not. It's just a flag. I have no idea why. What you should use instead is encoding. Encoding is actually a full layer that's essentially taking input from the layer beneath it, use encode PM to encode that, code that from whatever it was to UTF-8, and then pass that on, which is actually a fairly sensible thing to do, even if it's not the fastest thing to do. This does lead to some interesting issues. There was at some point one of those long-standing bugs I mentioned previously was related to encoding and CRLF. Like I said, you have to think of PerlIO as a stack, and that means the order matters. And CRLF translation and UTF-8 are compatible with each other because they're both essentially ASCII compatible. However, encodings that are not, like UTF-16, hit issues. Because what happens is that CRLF is a perfectly valid bunch of bytes in UTF-16 that does not mean carriage return line feed. I think that if it's an aligned CRLF is some kind of Chinese character. I forgot which one. But it's an existent and perfectly valid Chinese character that turns the rest of the stream into invalid UTF-16 until the next CRLF. And unaligned, it can happen in like a few thousand ways. To be honest, I don't understand why people combine these two things. I really, really do not. But apparently, in the Windows world, there is some kind of convention to do this. And you have to really realize, you have to know, you have to do it in the right order, and you have to first disable the CRLF using raw, then put the encoding, and then put the CRLF. And any other order is just broken. Worse yet, in older versions of Perl, this wouldn't even do the right thing on bin mode. It would do the right thing on open, but not on bin mode. Uniquely special. Another fun one is encoding in bytes. Because like I said, encoding converts anything into UTF-8. And then it will claim this is UTF-8. However, if you add the bytes layer, you're saying, I'm promising this layer is returning Latin 1. So what happens on input is it gets converted and then interpreted as the wrong thing. But that's not half as horrible as on output. You have valid UTF-8. It gets converted to Latin 1. It gets interpreted as UTF-8, and then converted to whatever. This is just incomprehensible mojibake. Like I said, UTF-8 and bytes are evil. Do not use it unless you're really, really sure of what you're doing. In this particular case, what the user would have wanted is pop. Pop is a rarely used but really, really simple layer that just pops off the topmost layer. It's one of the ironies of the PerlIO interface is that you have to push a pop layer to pop it off. Great. And finally, there's raw, which is the other sensible thing. Because on encoding, it will pop off the layer. If it's done on most other layers, it will just turn off the UTF-8. And on CRLF, it's kind of weird because why would you have cross-platform consistency? Who needs that? Again, it will turn off the flag on Windows, except that on Linux, on Unix, it decides, well, you probably are using a PerlIO layer underneath, so I can just pop it off entirely because you still have some kind of buffering. On Windows, it doesn't because you kind of always want some kind of buffering. Another important thing to realize about PerlIO, it's open-ended. The layers I've listed are like the built-in layers that come with Perl. But there are a zillion other things, some of them useful, some of them less useful, that you can do with it. PerlIO Via is a well-known one that allows you to write PerlIO layers in pure Perl, which means you can do like really interesting things, transformations. I've seen someone do like bioinformatical stuff in a PerlIO Via layer. I think that's poor judgment, but it's possible. Well, gzip is another obvious one. You can just add the gzip layer and then pretend it's an ordinary file, even though it has just been unzipped or zipped. And then there's like HTTP, which is a cute little module of mine that's essentially doing the HTTP request and then pushing a Scalar layer and just pretending that everything is magical. It's an ugly hack, but it works. And I think there should be more interesting layers. I think like on crypto and on SSL, there could be a lot more. There are a lot more possibilities, but no one has ever written them. And I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop here. Any questions? Hmm?
How hard is it to write one of the pure Perl ones? Simple in and out.
It's not that hard. It's basically you have to override like you mainly have to override a method that's just mucking around with the data. That should not be very hard. Any other questions? Hmm? I can't hear you.
Are there any long-term plans for cleaning up things that are like really broken?
Yes, I have the plan to fix a lot of that stuff, but that is a lot of work.
Is the bus factor still 1? Careful, Leon.
Closer to 1.5 to 2, I'd say. But the thing is, Nicholas Clark is a very busy man, so he could do a lot of stuff. He doesn't have the time. Thank you for your attention.